Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Before we begin this video, I would like to provide you this week's update to our crowdfunding progress. As of January 7th, we have attained 50,700 euros thanks to 1,805 donors, which makes around 92% of our crowdfunding target achieved. Our goal is to reach 55,000 euros by January 10th, hence there's only one day remaining. In case you're watching this video after January 10th, you can still contribute to our crowdfunding campaign as we will announce the final results on Monday, January 13th. If all of our 155,000 subscribers or just the amount of people watching this video donate today, we'll be able to reach our crowdfunding target with ease. In case we surpass our crowdfunding target, we will invest the surplus amount into improving the organization's working capacities, which concretely means improving the working condition of our members that will lead to the production of more interviews, reports, and documentation with better quality, both in terms of production and editorial value. You'll find the links to all of the donation platforms in the description of this video below. I thank you for your generosity and your support. Today, I'll be talking to physician, activist, and politician, Dr. Jill Stein. Dr. Jill Stein also ran as a presidential candidate in the 2012, 2016, and 24 presidential election in the United States, representing the Green Party. Dr. Jill Stein, welcome back to the show.
Really great to be with you, Zain.
Before we get into current issues, I would like to first discuss the 2024 US presidential election. In the 2016 election, you received 1.4 million votes, or 1.06% of the popular vote. However, in the recent election, that dropped to 782,528 votes, or 0.5% of the popular vote. During the run-up to the election, Green parties in 16 European countries, that included Germany and Ukraine, distanced themselves from your party and stated there was no links between the Greens in Europe and in the US. They released the following statement, and let me quote them here. Quote, "We are clear that Kamala Harris is the only candidate who can block Donald Trump and his anti-democratic authoritarian policies from the White House." Unquote. Some might interpret this setback of the Greens due to internal disputes within your party or a general declining interest in climate issues, a trend we've been observing in Western countries, while others view it as another sign of growing power of the media and the political establishment, which ensured that voices like yours were completely marginalized. What do you think is the significance of your election result?
I think the election result really showed what a concocted and manipulated exercise this election was. Really the worst that I've ever seen. I've run for president 3 times. This was by far the most intensive exercise in pure propaganda, in censorship, and in smear campaigns. Now, the good thing was that the Greens came out the strongest of all the alternative parties. So it's not like just the Greens went down. Everybody went down. But we actually went up among the relative strength of the parties. And we emerged as the strongest alternative party. And the Democrats, or I should say the anti-democratic party, was pulling out all the stops in this election to really suppress democracy, to prevent people from knowing that they have a choice. The bottom line, to put this simply, is that Americans, like people all around the world, but in America, we have especially severe economic disparities. We have a really rigid, powerful oligarchy that's rolling in dough and which exerts enormous economic and political power. Everyday people, working people, are in very, very bad shape in this country. We have no, health care to fall back on. We don't have free public higher education and so on. It's like you pay to the hilt for everything here. And the statistics are worse than ever. Something like 66% of all Americans now are living paycheck to paycheck. Half of all Americans are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Somewhere around 40% of all Americans report that they can barely cover their essential expenses. So people are in very bad shape. And along with that goes an enormous and growing demand for political alternatives. But those are being very carefully suppressed and denied to the American people. So no debates, no coverage in the mainstream media, and it's worse than ever. Even our so-called progressive media mostly did not cover. Even Democracy Now! Did not cover us until like the final 2 months of the campaign. And that's very unusual. So we've just seen the kind of stranglehold of censorship and economic and political control really clamp down on our whole political system. This was the first race, in which we were the source of, or let me put it differently. This was the first time that the Democrats ever felt they had to conduct an advertising campaign against a third-party candidate. They were that frightened about it. And that began after our appearance on the Breakfast Club. And I recommend that your viewers take a look at the Breakfast Club with myself and my running mate, Butch Ware. This was like a very hip, Black, young crowd that hadn't heard of our campaign. We were attacked by the kind of Democratic Party attack dogs who were at the who were in the interview, and we punched back in a very big way. And if you read the comments, what you'll see is viewer after viewer. There are 20,000 of these comments now, basically all saying the same thing, that, oh my God, I didn't know there actually was a candidate that represents how I feel. And I wasn't going to vote. Now I'm going out to register green. We're not just a environmental, climate, clean air party. We're very much a pro-worker, anti-war, climate emergency, anti-genocide campaign. And so we're also pro-reparations, pro-Medicare for all. We take a very principled stand on what we need to survive. And that's both air and water and a climate, but it's also, it's the roof over our head, it's food on the table, it's quality jobs, and so on, and a real democracy. So at any rate, what this election showed was that people are fighting angry. The Democrats, not only, conducted advertising campaigns, they had a whole, what they called war room. They had a war room whose budget was way bigger than our entire campaign. And their war room was basically where they conducted smear campaigns, and they called up press. They would track our schedule, and before we had an interview, they would reach out to the press and try to feed them smear information. This actually, Tavis Smiley informed me about this. Tavis Smiley, who's a progressive independent journalist, largely Democratic, but he was so resentful that the DNC was trying to basically control the interview. So, they were conducting this smear campaign at great expense against us. They also advertised for infiltrators and spies to report back and disrupt our campaigns. We've caught them in the act before, but we've never actually seen them advertising for people to manage spies and infiltrators. So it really confirmed, what we're up against, which we've sort of suspected for quite some time. And they also spent a huge amount of money on an army of lawyers to basically conduct lawfare, that is, very unprincipled manipulations of the law based on gotcha details rather than the spirit and the intent of the law. And they did that in order to throw us off the ballot. And it wasn't just us, it was also PSL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and Cornel West. It was the three of us. And then it was RFK also, although he's in a very different, I don't regard him as an anti-war or people-powered candidate. He's kind of in a different category, but nonetheless, the Democrats felt quite threatened by him. So he was a part of this war room initially, and then once he dropped out and wasn't a threat to the Democrats anymore. But they very much continued to focus largely on our campaign. We were perceived as the major threat. And I have no doubt this is still going on after the campaign because they're more vulnerable than ever. And what emerges from this election is really a very clear evidence that the Democrats are not capable of fighting Republican extremism. They're not capable of fighting emerging fascism. They are not capable of fighting genocide. They're conducting genocide and censorship and a war on working people and the climate, for that matter, and the environment. So it's really emerged that the Democrats are just not up to the job. And Americans are struggling more and more. So we come out of this feeling really very supercharged. And one last point here, which is that we made very strong connections with whole new constituencies, in particular, the world of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. We found real community in fighting genocide, also with students and the campus resistance movement, the resistance to genocide, also with the Black liberation movement, the Black community, which is not tied to the Democratic Party whatsoever, and the community that is calling for reparations for descendants of enslaved people. So there were really strong bonds that emerged, that live on, and that provide a really strong basis to continue organizing, because the empire and its elites are crashing and burning before our very eyes. It's just a question of when we hit the tipping point.
Jill, it's very inspiring to see your positivity. However, it seems that anti-war and progressive voices and movements are on the decline worldwide. Global wars and inequality can be argued are the root causes of migration, an issue which has taken center stage in both the US and the United States. The voices arguing that people don't want to leave their homes, families, and communities and risk their lives by traveling thousands of miles to other countries unless conditions force them to are losing ground, while the voices that argue that these people are coming on their own accord to destroy our own culture are gaining ground. I mean, if we take Germany, for example, a country which is taking millions of refugees, most of them have come from countries where the US is involved, be it Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, or Ukraine. I think a common ground between the left and right on migration could be achieved if Western wars and interventions, as well as global inequality, were brought to the forefront. This does not mean that we cannot pursue a sensible migration policy in the immediate term, but if we make migration the sole issue, it seems to me that we are focused solely on treating the symptoms without ever addressing the root cause. How do you see the future of anti-war movements? Have we reached a point of no return, or is there still some hope for the future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it is a psyop. It's basically a psychological operation intended to convince you to be hopeless, to convince you that you are powerless, to convince you that resistance is futile. But if you actually look carefully at what's going on now, what you see is a right-wing reaction to neoliberalism. It's because progressive movements have really been hijacked. In this country, it's by big money. It's big money and corporate control. And I presume, that's happening to various degrees all over the place. You have kind of the American paradigm, which has really taken over politically. And the neoliberal agenda of the Democratic Party in this country, that has been universalized, certainly through Europe. But if you look at what's going on then, when the progressives can break through the neoliberalism, that is the problem, that progressives are being hijacked into neoliberalism and not really standing up for a truly working people's agenda. And we see this happening in country after country. But look at what just happened in Mexico, for example. In Mexico, you have the so-called Morena Party, which was, they've only been around for like 14 years, and they just took off, partly because Mexico had campaign finance reform and they also had media reform, so that opposition parties could be heard. But they made a decision, which was to bring together the small parties of the left. And once they unified, they took off. And in this, AMLO, Lopez Obrador, was, he was reelected. No, I'm sorry, they're only elected once. Yeah, he just finished his 5-year term, I think it is. Forget whether it's 5 or 6 years. It's a good long term. And he left with like an 80% approval. It was huge. Not that he didn't have, struggles, but people support him. And Morena is a real people's party. And his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, she won with a overwhelming majority, 60-some%. And for the first time, Morena won a majority in one of their houses. They have 2 houses, and a near 2/3 majority in the other one. So they'll be able to have much more power this time around. And I think they won all the governorships. So Mexico, remember, was ruled by a neoliberal party, the PRI, for like 60 or 70 years. And then people just got fed up with the corruption. And because parties of the rich usually have the first take, because they have the tools to propagate their message. So it was a conservative party that came in next, the PAN, but they basically ran into the same problems of corruption. Conservative parties cannot solve the crises that we faced. So that's when Morena came in. And it's interesting how this kind of neoliberal government first went conservative, and then people just had it and they went super progressive. And that's a great paradigm. Or look at France, for example, where the extreme right was on track to win their parliamentary elections. This was a couple months back. And the small parties of the left got together and they blew the right wing out of the water. So that tells you that the problem here is in our election system, which is not capturing really where the public is, that the system needs to be trashed. The system needs to be transformed. And if we can get the big money out, if we can, get free airtime, equal airtime, things like that, and they have real campaign finance limits in Mexico. It's staggering. We have no campaign limit in this country now. It's however many billions you want to contribute, you can do that through a super PAC or through dark money. So we have corruption on steroids, and people are really sick of it, which is why the Democrats are so threatened by our party, because we actually are offering what people are clamoring for. And they are terrified that what happened on the Breakfast Club is exactly what will happen as word gets out. And, times are getting more desperate all the time. So the potential to break through grows all the time. And on immigration, just to answer your question about that, our approach to immigration is that the most powerful thing we can do, the most critical thing we can do to solve the immigration crisis is simply to stop causing it in the first place through endless wars, through regime change operations, through unbridled climate change and the devastation of farmers, for example, a lot of who's coming to the US, millions of farmers who've been put out of work by changing climate. The drug wars, we can stop the war on drugs here in this country. We're financing it. over the border as well, simply by decriminalizing and by ending our funding for the war on drugs. We can massively cut the income of the drug cartels and eliminate drug cartels as a major driver of migration campaigns. So this is not rocket science. This is just about having integrity and actually speaking to what it is that people want and demand. So your point, people don't want to migrate. They don't want to get in a boat unless it's more dangerous, to cross the Mediterranean in an open air, little rowboat or some other, very flimsy and dangerous vessel, unless that's less dangerous than it is to stay where you are. So we can stop this forced migration. It's forced migration. It's not a migration of choice. So we can do right by migrants at the same time that we do right by stability, all around. In this country, we have this myth that we know is false. That myth says that migrants bring drugs and crime. It's actually the opposite. It's red-blooded Americans who bring drugs and who have a much higher crime rate than migrants. So it's all about just being able to get the word out. And, we are very focused now coming out of this election, beginning to really double down on grassroots development. We have lots of local candidates. We have, I don't know, some 160 or 70, 80 now, something like that, local electeds, and they have a very high rate of reelection. Now that we have a more economically diverse base, we're very hopeful that we can do much more vigorous fundraising and support many more candidates to be running for local office where there's a lot you can do. For example, in ending, by enacting boycott, divestment, and sanctions at the local level, by ending funds to corporations that profit from genocide and from apartheid. So a lot of exciting stuff in store.
You mentioned neoliberalism, and an important feature of neoliberalism is a strong military state. And that is my next question. President-elect Donald Trump caused a huge stir in Germany when he stated recently that NATO countries in Europe should actually allocate 5% of the GDP into militarization instead of the previous threshold of 2%. According to Euronews, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte made similar remarks last year, stating that the 2% threshold of European NATO members is not sufficient to maintain long-term deterrent against Russia, and that the European citizens should accept sacrifices, including cuts to their pension, health and security system, in order to boost military spending in Europe. The mainstream political parties in Germany rejected Trump's demands for 5%. Nevertheless, there's a consensus on increasing from 2%. The Green Party Chancellor candidate Robert Habeck told Spiegel magazine that Germany should aim for 3.5% in the upcoming years. And Chancellor candidate of conservative CDU, Friedrich Merz, who's most likely going to succeed Olaf Scholz as Chancellor, stated 2% is the bare minimum and there's room for more. Germany currently spends 90 billion euros on military, which is around 2% of NATO's target, and 5% would mean double the amount, around 240 billion euros. As someone who lives in a militarized society like the United States and has spent her entire life resisting it, could you tell our viewers what impact increased military spending will have not only on our culture, but also on the social fabric in Germany?
Yeah, and I want to encourage people to consider what the Green Party of the United States would do. We're a very different we're a Green Party that's true to our roots. We have not been co-opted by the neoliberal agenda. We're true to actual green values of peace, which is one of our founding values, peace and decentralization, decentralized democracy, healthcare as a human right and all that. and eco, ecology as a value. So we are true to those values, and you lose them all when you militarize. You lose them all because that's where you'll be putting your funding. And you want to think in terms of an alternative. Really reject the paradigm. There's no going with that paradigm. It's only going to rob you blind. Recently, Donald Trump is threatening Canada that he's going to, just put the economic screws on Canada if they don't, join the United States. Well, one of the Green Canadian, one of the Green Parliament representatives in Canada said, no, actually, it's the United States that should join Canada because that way you'll actually have a healthcare system, and you won't have this horrible oppressive failing democracy or something to that effect. But yeah, I mean, I would really turn on its head what is being inflicted on Europe. I mean, why is Germany's economy failing in the first place? Because Biden gave the thumbs up, or more likely committed through the US itself, the blow up of the Nord Stream pipeline, and denied you cheap Russian gas, which, drove your prices up, which conveniently forced Germany to then purchase US fracked gas at far greater rates and wrecked your economy. So what are you doing taking advice from morons like that who've actually destroyed your prosperity? You want more of that? I mean, how does one even begin to be that brain dead, as to think that, to take your advice from those who've already basically thrown you over the cliff? So, yeah, I mean, you do not want to model yourselves after the US economy, where, as I mentioned before, 66% of Americans now are struggling, living paycheck to paycheck. 100 million Americans, which is, it's a lot of adults. It's a huge amount of adults, are in medical debt right now. Many, 42, are in student debt, and we don't have the jobs. 50% of people are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Watch your health statistics crash and burn. We have the lowest rates of longevity, the highest rates of chronic disease, especially cancer, which is moving its way down the age spectrum now. So there's a whole epidemic of cancers now among young people, like under age 40. One of our fastest rising rates in cancer. Like 1 out of every 3 Americans is diabetic or pre-diabetic. We are a very sick culture, because we're a sick nation, because we have a very sick democracy. You're not going to have healthy people if you don't have a healthy democracy and a healthy economy. You're not going to get that through the neoliberal agenda. And let me say, it's not only our health, it's our very lives that are at stake. Don't even think about the climate for a moment, because it's not as immediate as the risk of nuclear confrontation, which could easily happen. In fact, the US and Biden are begging for it right now. And you're probably aware that Russia now has these super fast missiles, the Oreshnik, which travels at a rate of something like 1.8 miles per second, just absolutely unfathomable. And then they have a bigger gun called Avant-Garde, which travels at like double that speed. So these are untouchable. We cannot defend against them. We go to war, boom. I mean, all they do is have to send one missile. Gone is your aircraft carrier. It's gone. I mean, and this is not even going nuclear, but we are going up the escalation ladder right now. And and maybe we'll save that for another question before I get into Ukraine. But just to say that our lives are on the line here with this neoliberal militarized agenda. We could all be going up in smoke with a mushroom cloud here very readily now. Not to mention, going up in smoke with the latest climate crisis, like what's happening right now before our very eyes. 130,000 people had to evacuate on an emergency basis yesterday. You move 130,000 people from anywhere, as an emergency evacuation, and people are going to die. I mean, that just happens. And when they're fleeing the flames that are rapidly spreading, this is an emergency. And this is what the future looks like. So it's on all counts, we cannot have a functioning society or our health, our education system, whatever. We're going down the tubes here at an accelerating rate. So, let's wake up and stop taking marching orders from the corporate predators who are thriving on our, on our disasters that they are causing for our economy and our society. We can do this. It's not rocket science. Let's just be accountable to people and not to big money.
I would like to switch gears and focus on Syria. Today marks a month since Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in Syria by a number of militias, most notably Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, now renamed as Ahmad al-Shara. In Western countries, a reassessment of policy towards Syria is taking place, given HTS's past affiliation to al-Qaeda. In December, the US State Department sent a diplomatic team to Damascus and expressed its willingness to work with the new government. This week, the US announced that it will pause certain restrictions on Syria to allow transactions to take place that are necessary for the provisions of public services and humanitarian assistance. And this is being viewed as a first step by the West of the entire sanctions regime being lifted. Furthermore, the US currently in talks with Qatar and the United Arab Emirates about relaxing further financial restrictions on Syria under the condition that it cuts all ties with Russia and Iran. A few days ago, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot were the first high-level diplomats from the European Union to meet with the Syrian de facto leader Abu Muhammad al-Julani in Damascus. According to Baerbock, the aim of the meeting was to determine whether the new government would ensure that all ethnic and religious beliefs would be protected. And let me cite her here, quote, to discuss whether such an inclusive political process is possible and whether human rights can truly be guaranteed. The required lifting of sanctions is tied to this, unquote. How do you assess the West's policy since the fall of Assad? And do you think the West is really concerned about human rights and protection of minorities? Or are other factors driving this policy?
Well, the US has a long track record here. If it's suddenly turning over a new leaf after, decades of imperialism and just raw, neocolonialism, that would be remarkable. But there's absolutely no reason to think that that's going on. It's a win. I want to acknowledge that it's a win for the people of Syria that they are no longer subject to a very brutal dictator. That's great. And all the, people I know of Syrian descent and Muslim Americans, they're greatly relieved not to have the brutality of Assad over their heads or their relatives' heads. But, there are many players here, there are many moving parts, but the overarching, the elephant in the room here is the US empire, which has worked clearly with the extremist groups. We know they've been funded by the likes of Timber Sycamore, this project through the CIA that spent $1 billion to basically foster these violent opposition groups and inflict a civil war, or shall we say, exacerbate the civil war. There are many mixed themes here, but part of them is the regime change operation, a violent regime change operation being conducted by the US. This is not, it would be unique if that were not the case. This is how we roll. We have regime changed some 80 governments since the Second World War and then conducted wars on the others. Those are 80 regime changes, even without wars. So we tend to work through covert operations. And as Larry Wilkerson points out now, we're not capable of conducting a war. So we have to outsource our wars because for all kinds of reasons, we don't kind of have that fiber or that backbone or whatever, so we're fighting to the last Ukrainian, or to the last Syrian or to the last whoever. It's not us. We just profit from it and we just call the shots. And instead of international law and human rights, what is it that we talk about? We talk about the rules-based order, which is decidedly not human rights. The rules-based order is not written down. It's whatever we say it is at the time that we want it. So, if it's Israel, go right ahead. Take the territory of the Palestinians or the West Bank or Lebanon or Syria. Just do it. But if it's Russia that's trying to defend its border, no way. That's the rules-based order. We get to write the rules. Yeah, so it's nuts. And I think it's very unfortunate that that what could be a new beginning for Syria looks like it's getting hijacked right now into being a vassal of the US and probably Israel and our agenda for global domination. It's not a secret. That is what our military policy is called, full spectrum dominance, that no regional powers will, no power will be allowed to rise. Not even a regional power can be allowed to compete with us. And Iran is, kind of the essence of that. Israel, I should say Netanyahu, spelled out the 7 countries that he wanted overthrown. This was back, I think, in like the early 1990s. In a book, he spelled out those 7 countries. These were the same 7 countries that were named right after 9/11, when I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but it was a former NATO director who said, okay, these are the 7 countries we're going after. He was told. So he was told at the Pentagon, he was handed a piece of paper to say, these are the 7 countries that we're going after in the wake of 9/11. Not that any of them had anything to do with it. Saudi Arabia was not on that list of countries. It was Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and one other, I forget. But, any country that Israel perceives as not in its orbit, which is the same as saying, because Israel is the proxy for the US, Israel is the unsinkable battleship for the US, according to Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. Israel is the unsinkable battleship for the US. And, Israel needs these countries to be subordinated to its agenda. And likewise for the US. This is about maintaining global domination, control of global resources, and so on. So this is, totally expected that would be the conditions that are being imposed on Syria. And I think, the US is not in a position of strength. The US is doubling down now because it knows its days are numbered as the pseudo ruler of the world. We've been accustomed to ruling the world, but we no longer do. We are no longer the dominant economic power. And, military power follows economic, and Russia has leapfrogged way ahead of us very quickly. We should not be in the business of drumming up military confrontations right now, not with Russia and not with China, because they all have super fast missiles and they will make mincemeat out of us in the blink of an eye. So please, do not inflict collective suicide on us all, which is kind of what U.S. leadership seems to be demanding right now. And I would hope that Europe will recover its brain power and stop taking marching orders from a declining empire.
Let us now turn to the war in Ukraine, and I would first like to recap some of the developments for our viewers. Since Donald Trump won the US election in November of last year, Ukraine has intensified its attacks on Russia. A week after the election, upon receiving the green light from President Biden, Ukraine fired British and US-made cruise missiles at the Russian territory for the first time since the war began. As you've mentioned, Russia responded by launching a hypersonic ballistic missile at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro and also updated its nuclear doctrine, which now allows it to use nuclear weapons against countries such as Ukraine that are supported by a nuclear power. Although US President-elect Donald Trump met with Ukrainian President Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris on December 7th and called for an immediate ceasefire, 10 days later, Ukraine assassinated Russian General Igor Kirillov, the head of nuclear, biological, and chemical defense forces. On December 30th, 2024, US President approved a $2.5 billion military aid package for Ukraine. And on January 5th, Russia's defense ministry confirmed that Ukraine's forces launched a new attack in Kursk, a region in Russia that was taken in a surprise attack by Ukraine last August, which Russia has been steadily clawing back, while at the same time making considerable advances in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine President Zelensky has been calling for security guarantees, in other words, for some sort of NATO membership. In an interview on Lex Friedman's podcast, he recently stated, and let me quote him here, quote, "Trump and I will come to an agreement, and he will offer strong security guarantees together with Europe, and then we will talk to the Russians," unquote. How do you assess Ukraine's current war approach, and as well as persistence to join NATO? And why is NATO, in your opinion, being so hesitant on this issue, despite its proclamations of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes?
I think the U.S. is certainly asleep at the wheel, and it seems to be contagious, and Europe is asleep at the wheel here. This is extraordinarily dangerous. I say talk to negotiators, because negotiators know that there are ways to establish security guarantees for everybody. It's not a security guarantee if it entails NATO's missiles or anybody's missiles on Russia's border. You have to be able to ensure that Russia is not dealing with a Cuban Missile Crisis. In this country, we should know what a Cuban Missile Crisis is about, because we were ready to go to nuclear war over the inverse situation where Russia had its missiles basically on our border. We launched our nuclear weapons. They were in the air, in the airplanes, and they remained in the airplanes until the negotiations were done, some, 11, 12 days, something like that. We were constantly ready to go to nuclear war until we got those missiles off the border, and which was in Cuba, and not publicly announced at the time. We agreed to remove our missiles, which were on Russia's border in Turkey, very near to Russia. So Russia had actually been reciprocating what we had already done to Russia. So we worked out a mutual agreement, and then we went on to have nuclear treaties and so on, like the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. dismantled in 2017, I think, under Trump. We put an end to that treaty, which is why shall we say, in order to put these missiles on Russia's border, which is why Russia then went on to develop the Oreshnik. And they've upped us. We're going to spend our entire resources on the next arms race here. Is that how we should be spending our resources? Or let's just provide security and abandon U.S. imperial foreign policy. We need a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy, not on global economic and military domination. This is not rocket science. This is about being an adult in the room with a community of adults who can talk things over and negotiate and work things out, rather than being a bully in the schoolyard, which is what the US is accustomed to doing. It's not going to work. And remember, they got bigger guns than we do. So what are you thinking of? We've got to negotiate for our own survival right now. This is absolutely nuts. We get Scott Ritter on board. He's got a lot of good ideas. He's been a negotiator. Get Larry Wilkerson, get Jeffrey Sachs on board. These people know how to do this. And unfortunately, the morons in the US State Department and White House don't have a clue. So let's, leave that behind. Do not be dragged down by this kind of moronic foreign policy. It doesn't take, a rocket scientist here to figure out how you can ensure Russia's border is secure and work something out with Ukraine. And, the main thing is to just let go of this fantasy that NATO is going to keep expanding right up to Russia's border. That has been the goal for the past 30 years in US policy towards Ukraine. That is over. Let it go, because that's going to take us to nuclear war. We can't do that. So just let it go and let's be reasonable here. If you had any real sense of Russia's history and Russia's capacity, Russia is purely defending its border here. It is not on some imperial mission to, recreate some glorious Russian empire from prior centuries. It cannot do that. And it shows absolutely no intent of doing that. It's just saying over and over again. In fact, Russia agreed to a peace treaty that was negotiated under Turkey's auspices right after the war had broken out. So Russia showed that it could negotiate, it could agree, it could make compromises. So we need to do that like fast. It's not going to get easier because Russia is winning this war there, and the U.S. is out of steam. Trump has said he's going to tighten up the weapons flow to Ukraine, but I don't know, you can't really count on that. But the American people are sick of it, and so are the people of Ukraine, who are actually showing majority opinion in their polls that want an end to this war. This was a manufactured war that had everything to do with the U.S. Supported coup in 2014 that brought in this very divisive government. The prior government, wanted a balanced approach, and there are ways to do this, but we have been a driving force to polarize and accelerate towards confrontation and violence, this problem here. So we have the power to fix this.
I want to end the interview with Gaza and shed light on the humanitarian situation unfolding there. Reputable human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch recently determined through their investigation that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. In addition, last year, the International Criminal Court (ICC) issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas's military commander Mohammed Dev. Regarding the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, the ICC stated that they are responsible for the war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare and are guilty of crimes against humanity through murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. The situation in Gaza has become unbearable as the death toll today surpassed 46,000 people. Al Jazeera is reporting today that in the last 24 hours alone, Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 70 Palestinians and injured another 104. The United Nations on January 4th released a report that documented how newborns in the Gaza Strip are dying from hypothermia because of the cold weather. Shelter and supplies which would have saved their lives are still pending approval by Israeli authorities. Just today, 800 parents of Israeli soldiers and reservists came out and demanded that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu end the war, saying that they don't want Gaza to become our child's cemetery. How is the general mood in the United States, generally towards the suffering Gaza? Early on in 2024, a lot of student protests were taking place. There was a lot of demonstrations. Can you first talk about the mood in the United States? And then second, how do you think life will be for Palestinians once Trump takes hold of office?
Great, really great questions. The mood, I think, in the US is extremely desperate. Very shortly after the genocide broke out, public opinion had already moved into strong support for the Palestinians and against the genocide. It was like 68% way back in November, you know, a year and a half ago. And then not long after that, public opinion moved to supporting by a large majority an immediate weapons boycott to Israel, which is completely unprecedented. So people are horrified, absolutely horrified. And I have to say, the attack on the hospital system right now, and I want to give a shout out for the healthcare staff at the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, which was burned down, and Dr. Hossam Abu Safia, who is an incredible, hero, pediatrician, director of the hospital. He was beaten along with other healthcare providers too, and then basically abducted. And there have been some reports from other freed prisoners that he's at the dreaded Sede Tieman, I think it's called. It's like the Guantanamo Bay of Israel. It's a horrific torture center. He's probably there. And he's been arrested now for like 10 days. He's disappeared. So we are desperate upon desperate at what's going on, desperate for his release and his safe return, along with the other healthcare workers. But in general, like you're saying, every day we hear that babies are freezing to death, they're being burned alive, and they're being bombed and droned. And Israel, meanwhile, is cooking up more weapons for genocide at Massachusetts Institute of Technology at MIT. This is a good indicator of where the students are at. A couple months back, they shut down a contract. They were able to get a contract canceled with Lockheed Martin. Now they have exposed a contract, which they say is illegal, and it may very well be. I don't know the rules of it, but apparently MIT has a secret contract with the Knesset producing basically AI, robotic AI for genocide and specific innovations, which are absolutely bone-chilling, enabling drones to network with each other so that instead of being attacked by one drone, it's going to be an army of drones. Or instead of one robotic dog, it's an army of dogs. This is like really basic breakthrough research that the students have gotten wind of. Because it's secret, they exposed it, they found its funding, traced it back to the Israeli Knesset, and they are working very hard to get this contract canceled and expect this to be, breakthrough news very soon. They just did their first big interview about this, and I think it's really going to be under people's skin. And then Israel is coordinating their expulsion to try to get these students expelled for having exposed their murderous treachery here at MIT for allowing this research to go on there and for participating in it. So that is, I think, an example of what's the mood. The mood is fighting angry. The mood is very, tired of being suppressed and repressed and beaten down by cops trained by the Israeli occupation forces and trained in cop cities and being silenced on campuses, so people are walking around a little bit like they got straitjackets on, but they're not going to be restrained for long. Because there are other ways to fight back. And there's a really intensive conversation going on right now about what are the other ways to fight back. And I personally think that sooner rather than later, we're going to need, a massive boycott, sick out, general strike, because they can't bash us over the heads for non-participation. They can bash you over the heads if you're out demonstrating. They can arrest you for, for asserting our constitutional rights. Unfortunately, they can and do arrest you very violently for that. But they can't arrest you if you, shut down the economy for a week or even a day. And, I think this is where the organizing is going now, into bigger places, because we can't live with this. And there are successes. People are finding other ways to push back. In California, Alameda County, there was a group of nonprofits came together and fought to get their city council to basically abandon their contracts with Caterpillar, which supports, the occupation, the devastation, the genocide, and which profits from it. So they've been able to get a very important BDS contract adopted there at the level of their city council. There was another, and there are lawsuits now in California. There are two Congress members who are being sued by their constituents now for misappropriating our taxes, for using our tax dollars against our values and against our expressed will. So these are some of the, creative strategies that people are beginning to explore and starting to network, and people are in a fighting mood, because people just get that we are destroying international law, we are destroying human rights, we are normalizing the torture and murder of children on an industrial scale. It will come back to bite us. If we destroy international law in some vulnerable country overseas, well, one day that will be us, because we're not top dog anymore. And if you want that going on in your neighborhood, by all means, look the other way. But if you don't, it's time to stand up and fight it.
Dr. Jill Stein, physician, activist, and former presidential candidate for the Green Party, thank you so much for your time today.
Great talking with you as always, Zain. Keep up your great work. Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in today. If you watched this video until the very end, please just take a few more moments and visit the description of this video to find out how you can support our crowdfunding campaign, which ends in one day. Our journalism does not take any money from corporations or governments, and does not even accept advertisement, all with the goal of providing you with information that is free from any external influence, information that you just won't hear in the mainstream media. I thank you for support and for tuning in. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you next time.